I think that you have had access to a very sided point of view. I would give you some information so that you can form your opinion in a maybe more balanced way. The first comment that you made is related to possible kinds of abuses that the operation could have committed. And in Brazil, we have 4 instances of justice. I work in the first instance. Each act and each decision is reviewed by 3 different instances, 3 different
like
and
levels.
very independent courts. So whatever we do, there is an appellate court, then there is another court, then there is the Supreme Court. And each court can be reached through habeas corpus to discuss not only the arrest of a person, but also any kind of illicit evidence or argument regarding possible illicit evidences. So we have had more than 500 habeas corpus in this case, discussing all possible kinds of illegal acts. And they were not made by very poor people. To the contrary, they were made by the more affluent defendants and by the most prestigious lawyers. And only less than 5% of the habeas corpus reached success. And even in those cases, this habeas corpus did not review any kind of serious illegal conduct. We have to have in mind that the review of a sentence, of a decision, is very regular, it's very normal in a judicial system. So it's possible that a court disagrees regarding the arguments that were used to keep somebody in pretrial detention. That happens sometimes, but it does not make the pretrial arrest an abuse. It's very normal in the judicial system to have these reviews. And you said that people were kept in jail to confess. That's very false. That's very false. And I can show through numbers that. And there are some discourses, some narratives that were created against the operation that are repeated and repeated and repeated, as in the Goebbels strategy of repeating a lie like 1,000 times until it seems a truth. And there is a war of communications in this case, because we are facing the most powerful people in Brazil. Many of the politicians that we are prosecuting, they control a lot of media groups in their states. They have, a senator has like 50 people working under him. He has a media company which works for him and so on. And along the case, we kept under pretrial arrest about 10% of the people who were charged, not who were investigated, who were charged. It was not 9% or 80% or 50%, it was 10%. And only 3% without a prior conviction, only 3%. That means a low rate of pretrial arrests, even more when you consider that this case unveiled, this case revealed corruption or hundreds of acts of corruption committed for more than 10 years by a lot of people, and that even in contracts that were ongoing, there were commitments of paying bribes. So the pretrial detention is a medicine which is bitter, but is necessary to stop the crimes. And more than that, some people, as you said, say that we used pretrial detentions to force people to confess. That is absurd, totally absurd. I will show this to you through numbers, objective numbers. More than 70% of the cooperating defendants, they never were under arrest, never were arrested by us, more than 70%. And all the companies who are cooperating, they were never arrested. And we have more than 10 companies cooperating. And more than that, pretrial arrests do not lead, it's not a necessary condition for cooperation or even a sufficient condition. We have more than 240,000 defendants under pretrial arrests in Brazil, mostly poor, most of them poor. They are not our kind of defendants. Our defendants are very affluent. And we have more than 240,000 poor defendants under arrest in Brazil without a trial. And you do not have 2,000 of cooperation agreements with the prosecution office. That is, Not even our cooperation agreements do not stem from pretrial arrests, since more than 70% comes from people who were never in arrest, but also the pretrial arrests do not lead to cooperation agreements. And more than that, if we used pretrial arrests in order to make people to confess, after a pretrial arrest, then we would go to the defendant and we would present him with a very good choice and a very good offer so that he could cooperate and confess. But we never did so. In all the cases, 100%, the initiative of cooperating was from the defendant, through his lawyer. In all the times, it's not wrong for us to seek the defendant to cooperate, but for caution reasons, we decided not to reach the defendant. We decided to expect the defendant to come. Yeah, this is the point regarding abuses. So if there were abuses, we have 3 independent courts, very independent, recognizedly independent courts, who would point out the abuses, but this was never shown. This is regarding the supposed abuses. Now, in respect to the supposed political action, what I could say. First, we were chosen as prosecutors, as federal police agents, as judge, to work in this case before the first politician appeared. The first politician. Then we had politicians appearing in the case, and all the prosecutors, all the people who work in this case, they never had any kind of political involvement with any kind of political party, any kind of involvement. I was never affiliated to a political party or any kind of that. And for you to believe that 13 prosecutors who had no involvement with politics before, 50 people in the prosecution office, 50 people in the federal police office, 40 people in the revenue service, a lot of chains of judges, most of them were in the Supreme Court and in the Superior Court of Justice, were pointed out by the Workers' Party, were all together aiming to achieve injustice and together joining to commit injustices, to violate the law against a party. It's a kind of conspiracy theory that would never upheld to a person who knows our system. And more than that, in the beginning, people used this argument saying that, oh, look, they are catching more people from the Workers' Party. But even at that point, that was not true. Because the Workers' Party, it victimizes itself much more. But at that point, we had 3 political parties. And the Workers' Party was the second in the number of people who were involved and charged in the case, not the first one. And why we got these 3 parties among the 35 political parties in Brazil before the other ones, more recently? The reason why was that the first people that we discovered committed corruption was Mr. Paulo Roberto Costa. He was a director in Petrobras, this oil giant. And the Workers' Party was in power since 2003. And the Workers' Party had the president, and the president had the ultimate word in who would occupy each position of director or manager in Petrobras. And then we began our investigation, this guy, and we reached other 2 guys who were very corrupt and were directors of other fields of Petrobras. And we discovered that one was pointed out we had 3. One pointed out by Workers' Party, other one by the Progressive Party, and the other by PMDB, a third party. And what we discovered was that we have a coalition system. Brazil is a coalition presidentialism. And in order for the president to gather a majority in Congress so that he can pass his bills, he negotiates and he accepts the indication of people for these people to be in such certain positions, such as director of Petrobras. So it's obvious that only people of the coalition would be in Petrobras, not people from the adversary parties, because he gave the rules, he gave the orders about who would occupy those positions. And then we discover people related not only to Workers' Party, but also to other 2 main parties of the coalition. And then we reviewed a lot of crimes regarding that. And because we are in the federal prosecution office, and the federal police, and the federal revenue service, we reviewed crimes related to the government, to those who had occupied this position since 2003, when the party occupied for the first time and until 2016. And later on, we were able to review crimes in more than 26 different political parties, even from the opposition, from the other sides, right, left, center, up, below, beside, you know. And why was that possible? Because some companies that we had evidence against decided to cooperate, and these companies, they had contracts, not only in the federal government, but also in the state and the local level. And when they decided to cooperate, we required them to review everything that they had. And they reviewed that they had, for example, bribed people from opposition parties who were in the parliament ruling investigations. And then they revealed that there were bribes in the state governments ruled by other parties. And then now we have evidence regarding Mr. Temer, who is the current president of Brazil and was a vice president of the Workers' Party, but nowadays is very adversary to the Workers' Party. And we have evidence regarding Aécio Neves, who was the main other opposition candidate to the Workers' Party candidate in the last elections. And our General Attorney's Office asked to the Supreme Court the arrest of this guy for 2 or 3 times. So our aim, our goal is to fight against corruption wherever is the side, wherever is the person involved. This is our aim. And we do so not seeing corruption, fighting corruption as an end in itself, but to protect the same people who was, yes, helped by the Workers' Party in same dimensions. But the problem is that the Workers' Party, at the same time that it helped to diminish inequalities, it committed so much corruption that it fed the same inequalities that it was fighting against. We need a government which fights against inequality, fights against poverty, fights against hunger, but at the same time is a government with integrity, because integrity is the first thing that you have to have in order for people to trust you that you are pursuing the public interest. Without integrity, you cannot trust anybody. And we are in a system that we have so low index of integrity that we could say with some philosophers of the past that we have a tyranny, because people are pursuing their own interests above the interests of the state. And then we have another government that is ruling by their own rules for themselves instead of ruling for the people. It's a requisite for serving the people to have integrity. It's the first requisite, because only in this way you can trust that they are really serving the people and not their own interests. This is the reason why we are fighting corruption. And we are fighting corruption because the money that is diverted from Brazil, and we are talking about more than $60 billion per year, this money could mean that in 2.5 years we would have sewage system to more than 100 million Brazilians who do not have it. We would have drinkable water to more than 35 million Brazilians who do not have it. We could have an improvement of 1/3 of the money to the health system yearly, or to the educational system yearly. It's too much money. Our countries melt down on corruption. This is the reason why we fight corruption, and we will continue fighting wherever the party is, wherever the person is, and wherever the circumstances is. And this is our duty under the law. We can win, we can lose, but this is the right thing to do. There are fake news all the time, such as the fake news that you mentioned in the beginning. We are in the middle of a hurricane, people very powerful, a lot of these people who we are persecuting, they own a lot of local media, a lot of state media, and they can manage it to show what they want. And if they want to overturn our case, the main way, the main path to do so, or the only path that there is to do so, is to attack the case up to a point that public opinion do not support us anymore.
What Khadija, for example, achieved, it couldn't have been done without international support, because this investigative reporting requires a lot of research. And so we work in coalition with the different organizations or journalists For example, there is a Sarajevo-based organization called Organization for Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It's an excellent project. I recommend you to take a look at their website and their work. So they help us with due diligence and clearance of a lot of the findings that we find during our investigations. We start doing, for example, investigating the president's family's business dealings, and for that we needed support from outside. So if you find something interesting, or if you can't find, so we would appeal to our friends in Europe, in the United States, who would conduct this, investigation or report on our behalf. And when the report, for example, was done, we had one report about gold mines that president's family misappropriated. That basically, yes, gave this contract to his daughters, who registered the company in Panama. But to be on the safe side, because they can always take us to the court, and these guys have money, they have tons of money, and they can sue the company, they can sue the media organization. So we ask this OCCRP to conduct due diligence. Basically, they check every word, every statement, every fact that we discovered, and after they say like, okay, this is okay to go, then we publish the report. So because this is very, so in this regard, this kind of reporting on this scale cannot be done without support of our international partners. And there is a lot of talk about establishing international anti-corruption court. But of course, this is kind of crossing the borders of nations. This has to be initiated probably by organizations like United Nations or Council of Europe or European Parliament, and there is a lot of resistance against that. I mean, like even now, United States is refusing to subscribe to International Court for
International Criminal Court?
For criminal court, because it doesn't want its, for example, military personnel to be persecuted by international courts. So it's a kind of it's a good idea to move in that direction, and it will require a lot of political will on the sides of the governments. There were a lot of initiatives on combating corruption by United States, by the European powers, but of course countries like Azerbaijan would never subscribe to that.
Right.
They would never recognize the legitimacy of this court, and also because they say this is our sovereign issue. But of course, corruption has huge implications on not on the lives of people, in this case in Azerbaijan, but also it has huge implications on what's happening in Europe. The latest investigation Khadija was part of, it's called Landromat, like how Azeri government was laundering money through London-based companies. And I'll be talking about $3 billion.
Wow.
$3 billion which were transferred first from Azerbaijan to bank in Moscow, and then they were transferred to these London-based companies, which have almost no record of existence, but just they're on the paper.
Hidden ownership, no benefit.
Yeah, and then this money were used to buy powers, like political influence.
Yeah.
Members of the European Parliament were bribed, members of the Bundestag were bribed, members of the Council of Europe were bribed. And we call it caviar diplomacy, because Azerbaijan is famous for its caviar.
Yeah.
So, for example, every member of the Council of Europe, which is supposed to be, pan-European organization for protecting of human rights, they would receive gifts, cars, carpets. We have beautiful carpets. Caviar, very delicious, but very expensive. And government realized there's a lot of people actually in Europe. They like cookies, they like free cookies. So they would spread this money. In our case, it's now the role of journalists, like Khadija, like the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is one of the few remaining independent outlets, to do this work. So we basically doing work what prosecutors are supposed to do.
Right.
We find the facts, we put on the table, but government says, so what? Who cares? Like So that's why I mean it's a good idea to internationalize this, to push for the international efforts in establishing some kind of court of anti-corruption court, for example. But I think it's just a long way to go, because it again depends on the political will of the member states and the countries which are in trouble.
I will talk about two international dimensions of our case. The first dimension is a dimension of formal cooperation with other countries. Nowadays, money laundering has three main features. It is more and more professional. Nowadays, people are professionals in money laundering. There are people who commit the crimes and they deliver the money for third parties who just do money laundering. That's a very interesting thing. And the second main characteristic of modern money laundering is complexity. It's more and more complex. And nowadays the money runs around the world with the velocity of mouse clicks. And the third characteristic is specifically internationality of money laundering. We have formal relations with more than 40 countries. We sent or received formal requests in investigation cooperation in relation to more than 40 countries. Only in one case related to a huge company, it was a huge construction company, the major construction company in Brazil. It bribed a lot of people in Brazil, more than 400 politicians, but it did not stop in Brazil. It went to other countries, 11 other countries, with Brazil 12 countries, and they bribed people all around Latin America. And it's very interesting that although it paid bribes in 12 countries, they laundered money in 10 different other countries, different from the places where they paid the bribes. So you have at least 22 countries if you want to build the puzzle. If you are to have the complete landscape of what happened, you need to visit 22 countries. And it's not easy to build the puzzle when so many countries are involved. Just for you to have an idea, Switzerland has been a very, very cooperative country with our investigation. It has reached more than 1,000 accounts related to the money laundering of car wash case. More than 1,000. Even though it's very cooperative, there are two different appeals that a defendant can use in Switzerland before Switzerland share the documents of the accounts with us. That means that they will share the documents only after 1 year.
Wow.
So while the defendant can move the money from Switzerland to, for example, Monaco or Luxembourg, and back to Switzerland, and back to Luxembourg, and back to Monaco in like 1-2 weeks with clicks of the mouses, we are going to have the documents of these sequential transactions after maybe 5 years. It puts the defendants much in front of us. One of the main ways of concealing money is using offshore companies. What are the offshore companies? Offshore companies basically are companies that are built, that are made in fiscal tax havens. Tax havens or financial havens, but mainly tax havens. So if you would, right now, to have an offshore company, you can go online, for example, to Uruguay or Panama, and there is an office who will sell the offshore company to you. And you use this offshore company in other places, in financial havens. Because a lot of times, tax havens and offshore places are not good places for you to keep your money. For example, Panama. Panama is not a financial haven, but it's a tax haven. So you buy an offshore company in the tax haven, and you're going to use it where it's very safe for you to keep your money. For example, Switzerland or Monaco. People realize that the cooperation of defendants is crucial if you want to review, if you want to investigate corruption. Of course, corruption is a crime that occurs in secrecy. people who commit corruption, they have no intent for other people to discover them. They talk in secrecy. They establish the agreement. They will make a kind of mask on the illegitimate act that they produced, or even worse, the act that they produced may be a legal act that it was illegal only because bribes were paid. For example, when a legislator votes, is it wrong for him to vote to one side or to the other side? Of course not. He's free to vote. However, it's wrong to receive money for voting. So when you look at the acts of the legislator, it's very hard to say which act was a corrupt act. You can know only when you have the bribes paid. But even if you find the bribes paid, how can you connect the bribe to a specific act of the legislator? It's impossible without internal knowledge. So the cooperation from defendants is crucial for this kind of crime. And this was realized in the, people realized that in the international setting, and it was established in international conventions that this is very important. And then we internalized that as a law in our country. And this allowed car wash to develop. Car wash grew so big because each defendant, which wanted to cooperate and wanted their penalties to be diminished, they had to bring new facts and new evidence. And we have more than 150 cooperation agreements with defendants. And then you can understand why it grew so big. So this is the second dimension. The first dimension regarding formal cooperation with international authorities, and the second dimension regarding soft law, which influences the laws of not only Brazil, but all over the world. And when you work in a clinic, such as the Human Rights Clinic, and you talk about corruption, you are helping to build this soft law around the world.
Yeah, and I will take the essence of corruption and what is it preventing? It is preventing people from accessing something that they could have accessed otherwise. Some rights that are no longer accessible because of lack of integrity or because of corruption. And in that regard, in my field, I want to speak basically about organized corruption of culture. Mm-hmm. And how this affects also our movement to access rights even in the international forums. Because it puts us in a vicious cycle of trying to have access to rights, and then we are faced with the pretext that it is cultural specific, and then you dig behind that cultural specific and you see that it is not our original culture. It is a culture that has been organizedly planted during the past 30 years. And it is an organized way of corrupting culture, therefore really preventing us from accessing rights that would have otherwise been easily accessible, and we would have been working, from not below the zero, but from elsewhere. And so this is in a nutshell. How this has happened. I remember as a child, there were kiosks around Cairo saying fundraising for Mujahideen. It was at the time of the Cold War between the States and Afghanistan. And it was so open, and Sadat and his wife were giving gala dinners openly to fundraise for Mujahideen. Those Mujahideen who happened to be afterwards Zawahri and so on. They were the basis of whatever that happened there. And then after a while, we started having, women covering a new interpretation of Islam that wasn't there in Egypt before. If you see the black and white photos of Egyptians, of Kabul, of Indonesians, of no matter what, it was not, we did not look like that. We did not look the way we look in our streets today. It was planted. And with this culture that was promoted everywhere, and new things started to become stereotypes, new things that became cliche, that we should do this or we shouldn't do that, and so on. And it didn't stop there. When we go to lobby at the UN, there are usually camps of countries. People who usually say no to certain rights, people who we can rely on in pushing on, and there are always fights about the final resolutions, whether it will be blocked, not blocked, and so on. And when we lobby in the corridors, we are always stopped by, well, but your country said this is culture specific. Well, for God's sake, what culture? So I don't know where this can fit in your area of study, because usually corruption is focused on some more materialistic things, but if we take it to a broader area where you can see how rights can be affected and how access to resources, access to inheritance, access to this is affected by the so-called new cultures that are planted. Based on the new dress code that got promoted during the past 20, 30 years, the harassment in the streets is very high now. It is not safe streets anymore for women to dress moderately. Even the covered women are not very, very safe from harassment. And it has promoted the image of women as purely a sexual something, walking the street. If you are dressed nicely, even covered, but have nice colors, or you have a little bit of makeup, or...
Ma'am, could you dress like you are right now?
Yes.
There, today?
Yes, but I always feel that the way I dress is a kind of activism.
Okay.
Okay, when I was, I even dress more revealing in Cairo, but I do not have to walk down the street, but when it was still possible to wear a little bit mini skirt with a suit jacket and so on, and walk downtown and so on, I felt I'm onto something. I need to present something that is a little bit different, that would widen the margin a little bit. But the way we dress shouldn't be a statement. Okay, dressing in an ordinary way and going down the street should not become activism. Okay, so this is one of the things. But recently, in the past couple of years, with the rise of harassment and so on, a new dialogue started on social media and in the media, whether how the women are dressed justifies harassment or not. But I know that in the beginning of the sexual harassment in the street, it was something very new to me at a certain age to start noticing that. It wasn't the case when I was much, much younger, as a teenager or so. I knew that I could go to the club in shorts and rolling blades and so on, and do that way from home to the club without any problem. But then all of a sudden, certain things arise. Something else related, for example, to the inheritance. According to the Egyptian law that is based on Sharia law, women inherit half the share of men, and even that is more and more not granted. Like, women do not have easy access to that half share as well, under so many other pretexts. The right to divorce, the right to marry. We started doing a lot of legal changes recently in the past 10 years. But again, things were not really, that tight. I mean, in my family, for example, the inheritance of my grandfather went equally to men and women. I mean, it was not really such a big fuss and a big deal like these days. So this new culture in the rise is bringing on things that were not really on the table before.
Before she was arrested, we got information from reliable sources that she will be arrested if she goes back. And she was in Strasbourg at the session of the Council of Europe. And so everybody started calling, Khadija, don't go back, you will be arrested, we have this information. And then they start calling me because I was her editor. So Kenan, you can influence her, tell her not to go back. She's going to jail. And I know Khadija, I mean, and I said, you're going to jail, you know that. She said, yeah, I know. We were exchanging on Facebook. And I said, so maybe you shouldn't go. And she said, no, Kenan, if I don't go, that will be a message to everybody else that government won't. So they basically, we're afraid to go back to our own country. And this is maybe exactly what government wants. And she always goes against the mainstream. Like basically, Khadija's even thinking, like even what I said yesterday, she was singing in the prison every day, opera, and she has actually a good voice. Why? Because she told the government, you cannot silence me. That's my right. I'm singing in my cell, annoying you, and the guards hated that. But it's basically not following what government wants you to do. So she went back, and within 2 weeks, they put her in jail. Government would be happy to make a deal, like you leave the country, never come back, stay, abroad, but she wouldn't go and make any deal with the government in that regard.
When we first got to know that they are pressing charges against her, she was abroad, she was not in Egypt then. And we kept calling her and telling her, don't come, if you come back, you'll be put behind bars, etc., etc. And she chose to return. She chose to return, and she said, if I am to fight back, it will be from inside Egypt, even if I am in jail. And she chose to come back. So far, she has not been jailed. It is one problem after the other, but I mean, even with that, and even from the place of freedom, I mean, the internal freedom is usually very, very tempting.